Welcome to the Where Humanity Meets Technology podcast.
Your company is forever going to be at risk.
Cybersecurity does impact us all.
That is the way cybersecurity breaches occur.
What is that one aspect that keeps you up at night?
We are much more exposed than before.
This is our podcast.
Can provide great customer service in a secure way.
That is just like spot on.
Cybersecurity today is out of control.
I believe infinite innovation.
The unknown risk is what's so important there.
Understanding the context is a totally different thing altogether.
Excellent information.
Where we talk to business leaders about cybersecurity, data management, and advanced digital solutions to provide strategies to increase the profitability of your company.
Thanks for everything, and we'll talk to everyone soon. Hello, everyone. My name is Maurice Hamilton, and welcome to our podcast, Where Humanity Meets Technology, where I have the opportunity to meet with different business leaders, business executives all around the world. And so we have different conversations regarding what we can do for using technology for the betterment of humanity. Today, we have Den Jones with us. Den Jones is a security expert. He's a chief security officer with Banyan Security right now, and we have some very, very similar backgrounds. You worked with Cisco and Adobe and some of the other companies that we'll talk about in a moment. But before I begin, Den, if you can actually introduce yourself, and I have some really great questions for you today.
Hey, Maurice. Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm Den Jones. I'm Chief Security Officer at Banyan. Banyan is a small startup that focuses on SSE and Zero Trust, which we can dig into. And prior to that, I actually ran enterprise security at Cisco. And before that, enterprise security at Adobe. And originally, you can tell the San Jose accent, but originally from Scotland.
Oh, awesome. I'm so happy to have you here. And let me start off with that question in regards to Scotland. So tell me a little bit about your childhood and how you actually came to America. Scotland is from what I've never been there yet. I've been to Spain and some other parts of Europe, but Germany, haven't had a chance to go to Scotland. Tell us a little bit about what it's like growing up in Scotland and how did you end up here in the States?
Yeah. So the background here, this is actually a bit of Scottish landscape that my HR team actually put together for one of our fireside chats we done a while ago. So I've kept the background just because it's cool. It reminds me of home a little bit. But basically, yeah, I grew up in Scotland. I was one of those early 70s kids. And, life was humble, man. I mean, it was before computers. A lot of people just worked their ass off. And, just a hard working environment. And I was a postman when I was about 16. And I was always into music, right? So I love music and stuff. And I was in school bands and just, wanted to be a musician, really. And ultimately, I was at my friend's house one day, this guy who was about 4 years older than me, but he had loads of music gear. And I was just like, shit, man, how do you get all this gear? And he basically said to me, he's like, well, I went to college and I got these qualifications, and he now worked at Sun Microsystems in Scotland. And he's like, so, go do that. And I'm like, holy crap, man. And literally, like that summer, I left the post office. I went to college only on the motivation of I wanted music gear. And then roll forward, about the early 2000, like December 99, one of my former bosses who I'd worked with before, he was working at Adobe and he needed some help and called me and asked if I wanted to be a contractor for a bit. So I started contracting in December 99 with Adobe in Edinburgh, doing a lot of IT stuff, traveling around Europe and stuff like that as part of the European IT team. Eventually in 2000, early 2000, mid 2000 maybe, they asked if I wanted to go to the US. So they started the visa process. By August 2001, I'd moved to San Jose permanently. And literally, I was 28 years old, young kid, moved here with just some music gear, just some clothes. And that was it, and I never looked back, really. And that's me now being here 22 years, maybe 23 years. Mm-hmm. And I moved with Adobe. I was a sysadmin, like I was a Novell guy doing like Novell I could do like Novell, Windows, Sun, like Unix and Linux. I done networking. So, so I was a jack of all trades, right? So when I moved over here, I was pretty much in like this engineering systems infrastructure team. It was like IT, but really focused on a lot of engineering forward stuff. And it was great. I used to run Adobe's file servers that they used to build bloody Acrobat on every night. The nightly build happened on the server, So it was like I back in those days, it felt crazy for me, but as a young kid, just enjoying it.
I can imagine. I can see your path now. When you talk about Novell, I remember Novell, like Novell with 5. I was Novell certified way back in the day. Novell and Citrix. That was the thing back then.
Yeah. Well, believe it or not, I took when I moved over to the US with Adobe, they'd had some people try to deploy some Citrix before. They brought consultants in. They spent a lot of money and got a lot of nothing. And then I turned up and I grabbed a couple of the old Novell servers I was retiring, rebuilt them as Citrix servers, and reused the licenses that Adobe had already purchased and started to build out I think it was like a 50 user concurrent user platform to begin with. And then I got it to like 250. And basically we had people around Asia. I'd done a tour around Asia and realized that there was a lot of these apps and stuff that people were using. They were complaining about it. Because what I wanted to do when I'd done that little tour was I wanted to speak to all the people in the office. I had to touch every machine anyway, because I was cutting over from Novell stuff to Windows, right? So I was rebuilding machines and all sorts of nonsense. And I remember talking to people and they were just saying about how sluggish some of the applications that the IT team in the US had built, right? How sluggish these were. And I was looking at this, I'm like, holy shit, man, you're logging into an application that's hosted in San Jose from here and it is dog slow. So the minute I got there, I built this Citrix environment, I published those apps, and then contacted those users again and said, try this. And they were just like, holy fuck, this is brilliant. And I'm like, yeah. So the ability, without even asking your boss's permission, the ability to see a problem and fix a problem was something that just really got me excited when I was, doing my stuff.
Wow. And I can see how that now, as your role as chief security officer, how you can see you have to look for problems. And I think I love cybersecurity. I love when you go back and say, how can I stop bad actors from infiltrating anybody's network? Because that's what their job is, to go back out there, and they could do it maliciously. They could do it for ransomware. They could do it just for the heck of it to see if they can actually do it. So when you think about that, when you're protecting your organizations, what advice would you give to other chief security officers or individuals that's running their security department to kind of like I don't think you can ever 100% stop any kind of infiltration from happening to your systems, but how can you do it to make it as efficient, as hardened as 99% as possible? What advice?
Well, yeah, like you're right. I'd never put my credibility on the line and say I can guarantee that they'll never be in, right? But one of the things, I'll roll back to 2017 in Adobe. I was running enterprise security. That organization was responsible for proactive strategic security for the enterprise, right, for the whole company. So we didn't get involved with what's in code, securing is the code good and secure, but the build systems, like that was part of my team's remit, or the CEO's airplane, part of my remit, right? So we were like this kind of proactive security. And then one of my peers ran incident response, and we would partner our teams together to say, how are we being attacked? And what strategies will we put in place in order to try and thwart those attacks? So ultimately, one of the things that we looked at was, the emergence of zero trust, right? So, but before that was the big household name that it is now. 2017, we were looking at things like BeyondCorp, what Google had done after the Aurora incident, and that was very inspiring work that they had done. But we didn't have the Google money, right? So we're like, well, how do we do it our way? And it coincided with Adobe doing a survey across employees. Because what they had discovered was happy employees actually increased revenue of companies. So there was studies done, blah, 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 nonsense. So that's all good. But what they done was they done a survey across the employees, like what are the top things that annoy you about working at Adobe, right? And you get the usual, like the cafe, the canteen, that nonsense. But in the top 10 or in the top 5, one of them was logging in all the time, right? And passwords. And then the other one was VPNing in. And it just so happened that one of my architects had really hatched this plan about this zero trust thing. And what we were saying we will do is we will improve user experience by removing the need to use passwords, by removing the need to use VPN, and making it easier to access apps and services without thought of where you are or the app or the services. Because the problem with a lot of enterprises is you're moving to this environment now where you get more cloud services, more cloud apps, but then you've still got some legacy on-prem apps if you're a bigger company. So users are getting confused. They don't know whether they need to VPN in for this app or not, right? And some companies, if their security team's crazy enough, they are scared of people going direct to cloud apps. They want you to VPN in first, right? So we didn't want that. We wanted to improve security, but improve the experience. So the improved security stuff was we'll use certificates instead of passwords, and we will register your device so that if I'm logging in to your cloud identity provider like Okta, so if you do like adobe.okta.com, you put in den@adobe.com, you know Den's password because you got that in the dark web from some previous hack. And then you maybe say, Den, push the MFA a million times until you get sick and tired and eventually say yes. And now you've logged into my Okta account and you can see all my apps. Well, if you register your device, then you can't do that. So we wanted to thwart that attack. We wanted to get to a position where we weren't given VPN network level access, we're only given application layer access. And that means if my device was compromised, then it wouldn't be able to run riot on the network once a VPN in, right? So almost eliminate lateral movement. And then at the same time, the other thing that we were going to do was do a device posture check. You can't log into any apps or services unless your device meets the minimum bar. So my team in 2017, Maurice, we delivered that. We delivered that to 40,000 people.
Wow.
And I was on stage at Identiverse talking about it for the first time early 2018. And the thing was, in order to do that, I increased my team by one person and I spent $248,000, which actually I just reduced other spend elsewhere and reused that money. So I didn't increase my target. I didn't go back to my boss and ask for more money. We literally delivered this. Now, the thing for me when I think of leaders and strategy and things of this nature, I think a lot of new CISOs, they fall into the couple of traps. One trap is they'll maybe go to a SANS course and they're like, oh, I need to go do the SANS top 10 and know what I have and blah, 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 all this and all this stuff, right? And I'm like, yeah, that's cool. But it's almost like, I remember like the days of ITIL, IT Service Management, where people would go and they'd read that book and they'd be like, I need to do everything the book says. And like a little robot, they just go back and do what the book says. I get concerned a lot of new CISOs do that. So I think there's a place for a framework. There's a place for strategy. There's a place for tactical execution. There's a huge spot here for business. Like as a C-level person, you need to know how the business is run, what's important to the business, and what the business's unique risks are. Not all businesses have the same risks, right? So the reality is, I kind of look at it like CISOs need to not fall in the trap of instantly going out and trying to spin up 20 different programs or disciplines around like the security, defense, and depth. I think it's really important to start and get one thing right, which is a handle on your identities. your privileged identities, and how those things authenticate. And for me, that means tying them into the device. That gives you an added bonus of then knowing all, because when you buy a laptop, right, you don't buy a laptop for it not to access an app or service. And by the way, if I've got a laptop in the environment and it's not accessing my apps and services, I'm not as bothered about that laptop, with the one exception of it can be used to launch an attack if it's on your network.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, and we can talk about guest network and network strategies later, but when I look at like this whole thing called Zero Trust, or SSE, which is another Gartner stupid acronym, right? I look at these things as being, they solve a couple of problems. And one of the biggest things I was trying to solve was the ability for someone to get your device and compromise it, because we let you log in originally regardless of the device's posture. I mean, how stupid is that? It's almost like, okay, I know you think you know who you are because you logged in as Dan, but I've got no idea. Dan's got 5 devices and half of them don't meet a minimum security bar. So So that's what we were doing there. And by the way, when I went to Cisco, we done the exact same shit. like rinse and repeat the same thing, except it was 100,000 users.
Oh, I can imagine. Mm-hmm.
And we done that in 5 months. So and different technology every time. Now to kind of give the shameless plug of Banyan Security and what we do, we actually deliver that exact result. We solve those exact problems. And my team in Adobe, the 2017-2018 first run was a hodgepodge of gluing shit together, but the architecture meant that you were almost coming in to go out all the time. And I didn't want that. I wanted a cloud-based solution that you only come into my network if you're going to access an app which is inside the network. Otherwise, everything's all cloud-based. So I asked my team to find that company. So I set my architects off and said, find me the company that can do that. And then we get something good to talk about. So they bumped into the team at Banyan, 2019 RSA, and we done a deal with them at that point. Adobe is, Banyan's flagship customer still. And my old team at Adobe still work with us on a regular basis. And the one cool thing about it is, and that actually inspired me to join Banyan as their CSO, was I really loved seeing how this company would partner with my engineers and my architects in the Adobe team and really look at what the customer is trying to achieve and work with us to achieve it. And I was also really inspired by how fast the Banyan team iterates and pushes out new features and functions. And there's a lot of partnerships that we've got. There's a lot of API first kind of development. So if as an example, we integrate with CrowdStrike and SentinelOne, if those things discover the malware in your device, it tells us we cut the session. And also, we cut the session on that device, but not your other 4 devices, right? The old archaic way would be, I'll just change Dan's username and password, and because one machine's compromised, so therefore all of it is. I don't know. Yeah. So we are very precise in the actions and the integrations. Another new integration we done is DNS and URL filtering. So if you do get a malicious link, because earlier in our conversation that you and I had before this show, right, we're talking about like training your users. You can train your users, but the problem is, especially with AI, we're going to see a lot more sophisticated, personalized attacks. It's going to be like, hey, Maurice, I know you and Dan are good friends, and but and then all of a sudden, you're duped into really believing this communication is about you, for you, and not an attack. So the way you think of it now is training people to not click links is cool and all, but it's not gonna. It's only one part of your defense and depth strategy. Something like what we do is when you do go to click that link, we're using threat feeds, and we instantly say, hey, no, that's not a good place, don't go there, and we'll block it. So stuff like that I think is really cool, and we're now moving the security boundary to the edge of your device. And I think for me, that's important, because more and more we're traveling, more and more we're remote, more and more we're not going on to the corporate network. So it's really important that you think of like a new security paradigm shift. And that's really what we're chasing.
Wow. So you said
there's a whole bunch of shit in there, right?
You said a lot there. Well, I like the part when you mentioned about the security DevOps. When you find something with the DevOps that's going wrong with it, with the security, you automatically isolate them, so they're not going to be, even though they're connected with other APIs perhaps, or even with your network, you cut them off. You said, nope, until you fix this problem, you're not gonna develop any kind of software on our network. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and one of the things, and I wrote a blog on this, right? I always said so in Adobe, I reported to the CSO and I dotted line to the CIO. So every other week I would meet both of them and give a progress update on our Zero Trust implementation, because that was a partnership with both teams, right? And it was really, really interesting, because we were talking about the evolution and what this thing's going to improve and do for us. And everybody was very impressed about how seamless this deployment was, because we didn't need to go. We had 2,000 Okta-enabled apps. We didn't need to go to every app team and say, make changes to adopt what we were delivering. The thing we delivered, we injected in the authentication workflow in the background. App teams didn't have to do anything. And then when we were changing to use our reverse proxies instead of a VPN concentrator, it was all DNS rules. Again, the app teams didn't have to do anything. What that meant was we could deploy this platform, this environment, this solution to thousands of users in days. And the cool thing for me is that piece of it. Now, go back to the blog post. One of the things I said to the CIO and CSO was, hey, we should turn our networks into guest-like networks.
Yeah.
So we had a guest network, but if you publish all the apps and services via this Zero Trust model, then what happens is when I connect to your network, when I'm on premise in your network, we can take every Office network and make it like a guest network. Provided you've got internet access, you can access all the apps and services you need because we've published them, right? And they're like, holy shit. And I'm like, that even works when you do an M&A. We had an M&A with a company we bought that was headquartered in a high-risk country. We didn't have time to do the diligence on their network, their security, so we didn't connect their network. So what we done was we made all the apps available, and we just had to touch each workstation and give it a client. That enabled us to onboard 400 people in one day without joining their networks. I mean, it was lightning fast. And I worked with another M&A where we done like 2,500 people, I think, in a week. So the reality is this model and really simplifies how you build networks, how you consistently think of networks and how they evolve, and how if you just build your Office network like a Starbucks and devices can't see each other, this is the most important piece of this. If I'm on the Office network today, I can see thousands of devices. And remember I said earlier about that one laptop that doesn't access apps and services?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Right. In that model, the traditional model, that one laptop could be used as an attack vector, and it could hit thousands of devices in minutes, right? But if you turn that network into a guest network, that the only thing that can do is get to the internet, I don't care. I never care, because it can't do anything. It can't harm the company. So strategy on security for me is not just defense and depth, but it's also thinking about the operational cost of these things. It's thinking about how you support it, maintain it. What does it mean to the employee base? So it's not just, are we secure, but it's how are we going to do this in a way that is really cost effective.
Okay. So you mentioned a lot of good things there. You mentioned about not only if you actually set them up as a guest network, they're not going to have accessibility. 2, you talk about lower cost. 3, you talk about really reducing the element of risk because they're isolated. Even when you think about guest proxy servers, email servers, sounds like you kind of like isolate them. So if you don't have access to it, you may have access to it, but that's the only thing you're going to have access to. You know, you kind of isolate them.
And you don't get access to it at a network level. If you think of the OSI stack, you're not getting like the layer 2, layer 3. You're way up like 6 and 7, right? So all I can do is get to the application. See, that's it. And one thing I was going to say, that there was a couple of really great benefits that our CIO loved, right? One is when we swap out passwords for certificates, and you're using a certificate on the device and it's tied to you in the device and you're logging in, the users are not using their password as much, right? Very rarely would they use it. The other thing I built in both companies was a team called Security Intelligence, and it's taken all that SIM log data on authentication and it is understanding anomalous events. Now in Adobe, we open source homegrown that, and it had some like 4 college grads in that team. And they've done a kick-ass job on building this thing. In Cisco, we had a partnership with Exabeam, and we delivered the same thing. Now, when you're using this kind of technology for looking at anomalous events, think of it like when you do a bank transaction and your bank texts you or calls you, like, was that you, right? Well, that's exactly what we were doing. So the combination of password certificates and then doing the security intelligence, we shifted the model from changing passwords every 90 days to only changing passwords on compromise indicator. That reduced service desk password related tickets by about 60 to 80%. Thousands and thousands of hours saved a year on people not changing their password every 90 days and going through that bullshit. And then the service desk not having thousands of tickets. I mean, you're talking about the top 10 of ticket counts and help desks teams is related to passwords. Like any enterprise company at all, but in the top 10 is that. So you can imagine me saying, hey, buy our shit. And one of the offshoots is you're going to reduce service desk tickets related to passwords by 80%. It's almost a no-brainer, like it pays for itself.
Wow. So that's really great. We'll talk about now password. Are we talking about passwords, or do you guys have policies in place like pass phrases and you have to be like 16, 18, 20 characters? Yeah. Well,
the thing is, Maurice, it's all bullshit, really. Pass phrases, passwords. It doesn't matter. What happens is something gets compromised and the passwords or pass phrases are stolen, right? So or if your device is compromised, I'll get all the passwords on your device in a minute, right? It doesn't matter. So we kind of adopted NIST standards based on NIST password standards. And I think that's cool, but users aren't using passwords. So the whole never change your password again, only on compromised indicator, means that the next time they change their password, they can change it to whatever. They can use a password manager. I always say use password managers. I always say MFA is vital. And now I also say device posture, device registration. That's the third leg of this stool, right? And the policy, when you do change the password, is still like long, complex, blah, blah, blah. But because you're not using passwords in your daily use as a user, it doesn't really matter. You're not being prompted to enter a password because in the background we're throwing a certificate up and we're using that from the secure enclave of the device. So it's pretty cool. I kind of look at things like password managers and like FIDO, YubiKeys. Like I think these things, phishing resistant U2F keys and stuff, all good stuff, right? I mean, they're all good things. The big thing in your organization is, depending on your org, like, is it cost prohibitive, or how do you start? That's the big thing I always hear people talk about. So that's the kind of stuff that I strategize with other execs on. I get to do that, so it's cool.
Interesting. Let me ask you a couple other questions here. This is really great information, Dan. I really appreciate it. And when I think about it, I think that they're trying to pass new laws. I'm trying to think exactly how the law was written. This was last week I read that they're trying to make it, if your organization, and I want to say you may have a little bit more insight on this, if you're an organization with over X amount of users, the government, U.S. government is saying that if you have a breach or something that happens, where before it used to be like days and days and days, now I think they're making a set standard that you have to report it like right away. I want to say it's like within 48 or 72 hours. It's relatively
it's like I think they've shifted it down to about 3 days. And then in the language, they actually say material impact, right? So
that defined as?
Yeah, so you know, the way I think of this is legal counsel for most of these corporations, they're going to do that song and dance, dog and pony show about material impact or not material impact. But I think the other thing though is what really happens on an incident is, you know, the incident occurs, you think something's underway. Now, you don't know if it's a material impact until you get evidence that someone has exfiltrated data.
Mm-hmm.
So what's a material impact? And so you could be working the incident for weeks and weeks and still not have any evidence of data theft. So it's not that you've been breached, it's not that you're working a breach, it's once you discover there's a material impact, which I would translate that to being data has been stolen, right?
Right.
Or like records, right? Once you know that, then you need to start the notification process. And you know, you and I have had conversations about this before, about playbooks and run books. And
yes.
You know, if you've done, you know, good exercises like red team, purple team, blue team, you know, if you do tabletop exercises, if you've got playbooks and your run book ready, then you actually should have a good instant response plan. And part of that plan should be some canned notifications, canned communications. So if you actually think of it, if you prepare for the eventuality that one day you will be breached, then you've already got templates of emails, templates of press release, templates of this and this. Those things are important. But if you're naively thinking it'll never happen to you, then you know, then you're going to be screwed, you know. So it's always good to plan plan. I always say plan for all scenarios, and you know, just hope the good ones are the ones that work out.
Interesting. So let me ask you, this is really great. What's one last question here? If you were to give advice to a leader of an organization, when we have some really great topics that we talked about here. What advice would you give them? Because there's probably a lot of things that keep them up at nighttime with their organization. What one advice would you give them? Say, hey, look, this is something that's relatively simple to do. And if you actually kind of like just don't overthink it, what advice would you give them?
I mean, obviously, I'd say come buy some of Banyan's stuff. But other than that, I mean, I think I think the best advice would be don't try and solve all of the problems across all of the security disciplines all at the same time. Pick something that's vitally important, you know, like I said earlier, identity, and focus on doing that right. And once you've got a grasp of your identities, then you pick the next thing. There's nothing worse than buying more tools than you have staff. And there's nothing worse than starting 10 things and finishing nothing. So pick something, go deep on it, get it right.
Yeah, I like how you actually give a really great illustrations and examples of how you can reduce cost and risk, because you have to be in that kind of framework and you have to think logically about everything. You know, you're right, you can go out there, buy all kind of firewalls and all kind of different devices that, and all kind of sniffers, all kind of different things out there. Hire a team, a really big team for it. So do you really need that? You know?
Yeah.
So
and the interesting thing, you know, the interesting thing is all the vendors would love to sell you all their stuff, but the reality is have you trained your staff to become experts in these things? Mm-hmm. Do you have enough staff? Do they have enough time? And then the other thing, and you know, we're executives, right? So we're business leaders, which means we recognize We're working at companies where they're running a business to make profit. In order to make profit, that means their expenses need to be as lean as they can be. And I don't know a single CIO or CSO or CISO that is not under pressure to reduce their spend. So when you think of it like that, you can't afford to buy 20 or 30 different tools. You can afford to buy a few and get a few done right. And that's why, for me, I'm excited where we're positioned, because you have to log in, and the biggest breaches occur through things like password reuse, password compromise, the people clicking links. And these are problems that we've been solving for years. So I know we're uniquely positioned to solve these problems. And I think if leaders focus on just getting some things solved and not try to go broad, then, they'll be more successful.
Good. Great advice. Well, Dan, I want to thank you for this podcast here. We've had some really great conversation here about cybersecurity, and it's been a fantastic. I'm guaranteed somebody's going to take your advice. They're going to reach out to you and say, "Hey, help me!" So this is good information, which is what we want.
Well, that's the one thing. I mean, my role at Banyan, there's a whole element which is evangelism and strategy and working with other executives. So, one of the goals for our CEO is that I get out there and spend time on strategy with other people, because that just helps. I've got this broad depth of experience. It's not just what my company sells. So for me, it's like I can get out there and I can talk about identity. I can talk about privilege. I can do network security. I can talk about airplane security. Somehow in my career, we covered that shit. So the reality for me is, like, one of my 9 teams done some zero trust. It's not the only thing my organization done, right? So I kind of love to talk to people about strategy and defense and depth, and how do these things all intertwine, and how does that overlap with business processes and running your business.
Excellent.
So
this is
anyone
good.
can hit me up anytime, man.
All right, we'll put your information so people can reach out to you as well. So thanks. This has been a great podcast, and I would love to do a follow-up podcast with you. And we can talk all hours and hours on cybersecurity. We'll do something different. We'll talk about maybe artificial intelligence or something that's coming up that's in the future that we see that's happening now. We'll change it up a little bit.
Yeah, anytime. I'd love to come back on AI and all those topics. I mean, look, it's a huge industry. It's a huge field, and the world is moving fast, right? So there's always a lot to cover.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Den, and we want to thank our audience, and we'll put the information so you can reach out to Den as well. And if you like our podcast, please be sure to like it and keep continuing to follow us. Thank you, everyone, and we really appreciate your listening to our podcast today.